part 2 of Overcoming Rejection. It's fundamental to understand that the ministry of presenting the gospel to Muslims is a ministry of setting people free from a whole complex of issues involving rejection. It's fundamental that we need to be very committed to be disciples of Christ and free from the issues that are associated with rejection ourselves. And I think it's really instructive in this respect to look at Muhammad in some aspects of his life and how he responded to experience of rejection, and Jesus. One of the most interesting things is that they both suffered a lot of rejection, more than you might say would be normal. We all experience rejection in some ways, and some of us, sadly, a great deal, but Muhammad and Jesus both suffered a lot. Muhammad Ali Dashti, the Iranian intellectual, said, made his way into history with empty hands and in a hostile society. It was an uphill struggle for him in many ways. And Jesus also, as Isaiah prophetically says, was despised and rejected by men, a man of sorrows and familiar with suffering. How did they respond to that? It's interesting, the protester is standing there and he has the placard that says, "The prophet is the greatest man that ever lived." So there you have the self-validating response of Muhammad being replicated even today by his followers. But let's delve a bit deeply into Muhammad's experience of rejection and the nature of his life. The story really begins before Muhammad was born. Muhammad's grandfather had made a spiritual pact in which he agreed to sacrifice one of his sons to the pagan gods if certain things happened, and they did happen. And so the sons drew straws, and his father, Abdullah, was due to be sacrificed. But there was an intervention from another person from Mecca, and as a result, the father sacrificed 99 camels instead. So his father was dedicated to be destroyed, actually, as part of the origins of Muhammad's story. As it happened, Muhammad's father died before he was born, and it's a very interesting question exactly when that happened. Some Muslims have claimed that it's a miracle that Muhammad was in his mother's womb for a couple of years before he was born, because the father died a few years before Muhammad was born. So that raises some very interesting questions, doesn't it, about Muhammad's paternity and where he came from, and they came back to him later. But in any case, many people who experience the loss of a father or mother at an early age, that can have an effect of rejection in their life. He was fostered out by his mother, common practice amongst the Arabs, but again, it meant he was cut off from a relationship with his mother, and he was orphaned at 6. At that point, his grandfather picked him up and looked after him, but then his grandfather died as well. So he had a rough start, losing one person after another. He was brought up in quite a low position. He was sort of shepherd boy by a powerful uncle, so that was his home. And his uncle Abu Talib really was his protector, and never became a Muslim, but looked after Muhammad, and that's where he began his story. And in Arab society at that time, clan was everything. Relationships, your father, your mother who would look after you, your connections, and to have no connections or very weak connections placed him in a very vulnerable situation. And it seems that some of his wealthier relatives, his aunts and his uncles, they'd make fun of him, they'd mock him. Look at the little shepherd boy, they would deride him. And he reflects upon this, and it seems that it caused him a lot of pain. In fact, he didn't really like his aunts and his uncles, and in the Quran, in Surah 111, he curses his uncle. He calls his uncle father of the flames, meaning he's going to be suffering in hell. So he says, "Perish the hands of Abu Lahab, the uncle, and perish he. His wealth avails him not." So Muhammad is poor. His uncle is wealthy. His uncle's been mocking him. So he's saying, "Curse you, uncle. Your money is useless to you. You will roast at a flaming fire, and his wife, the carrier of firewood, upon her neck a rope of palm fibre." So he has this image of hell in which his uncle will be burning and his aunt will be carrying wood to stoke the fire at which his uncle is burning. You could say he had a few issues of relationships with his relatives. And the aunt was a bit of a poet. Poetic art was valued by the Arabs, and she made up a little ditty, "We reject the reprobate, Mudhammam," which is kind of a term of abuse instead of Muhammad. His words we repudiate, his religion we loathe and hate. So this is the context of Muhammad's kind of growing into adulthood, these conflicts with his relatives. He was angry that they had money, he didn't. They mocked him, they used their strong position of authority to give him a hard time. He was married at 25 to an older, wealthier woman. Islamic tradition emphasizes that she was much older than him, but since they had 7 children, it's very unlikely that she was in her 40s when she married him. It was probably a few years older. The earliest evidence is just some years older. She had already married 2 other men. She was a wealthy merchant. He was very poor. Normally in Arab society at that time, a man would pay a dowry for a wife, and then she would be like his chattel. He would be owned by her. But in this case, he, being a young man without any means, was picked up by an older, wealthier woman. And so that was already I don't mean to not quite demeaning, but it was a vulnerable position for him to be in. It was not the normal position of the machismo kind of strong Arab with his wife that he'd bought. It was the other way around. She was the husband she was the woman who picked him up when he was younger. And in fact, for the marriage ceremony, it required the father to officiate. So she got her father drunk to officiate at the ceremony. And when he came to later, he was very angry that she had married Muhammad. It's all written there in Ibn Ishaq, in the life of Muhammad. So I think that's quite a rejecting experience. If your father-in-law was only able to attend the wedding by being made to be drunk and then later cursed you when he realized what had happened, that's a pretty rocky start to your marriage, you know. They had 6 or 7 children, it's not quite clear, and 3 or 4 sons. They all died young. So that's also, life didn't deal him, you might say, a good set of cards. He had a rough time. And in fact, most of the initial converts to Islam, the people that followed him when he said that he was a prophet, were slaves or rejected people, marginal people. They were initially a bunch of misfits following a discredited and criticized prophet. In fact, at one point he visited another town and tried to get help from them, and they rejected him. And he said that as he went back, some demons heard him read the Quran and they converted to Islam. So some of his early followers were jinns, these demons. That's an interesting thing because it opens a door into the occult in Islam, which is quite significant. So the Muslims became a despised minority. The pagan Arabs of Mecca spoke to his uncle and said, "Your nephew has cursed our gods, insulted our religion, mocked our way of life. Either you must stop him, that is, shut him up, or let us get at him, or let us destroy him." So they tried to put pressure on the uncle to stop Muhammad from challenging their religion. They initiated an economic and social boycott against Muhammad. Some of the members of Muhammad's sect were slaves. So Bilal, a Muslim slave, was tortured by his owner. And as he was tortured, he was being asked to recant Islam, and he kept crying out, one, there's only one God. He was mocked, for example, called Mudhammam instead of Muhammad. Dirt and intestines were thrown upon him by the Arabs. He sought help from neighbouring tribes. He wanted a kind of powerful sponsor who would fight for him, but he was rejected. And one of them, the leader, said, "You must be very important if you're a prophet. You're far too important for us." And the other one said, they mocked him, "Allah should have found someone a bit more impressive than you. Who are you to be a prophet? You know, this is not very convincing." So he was rejected by those that he sought help from. So this is a very disturbing, painful story. Islam began with great difficulty, and Muslims are very aware, if they've had any religious education, of the struggle that it was at first for the Muslim community, the intensity of the opposition and the difficulties that they faced. They were almost might have been snuffed out, if it had been too harsh. And eventually they fled to Medina. Muhammad was able to get support in another place. Some of his followers fled to Ethiopia. They spent time under the protection of the Christian ruler there. There was a great deal of suffering. And This has an effect because in Islam the concept of Muslims as victims is a very big theme. I'll come back to that later. Muslims are the victims, and this is the sort of birth pangs of the religion. Involves a great deal of personal rejection for Muhammad and also for his followers. So it's a very costly and painful beginning to Muhammad's story.